The hurricane forest was silent, but it was not peaceful. December 24, 1944, and the forest had become a graveyard. For 6 long weeks, the Battle of the Bulge had raged, turning the snow-covered pines into splinters, and the ground into frozen mud and ice. Corpses lay stacked like wood, waiting for spring, waiting for someone to care. The air was thick with smoke and the sharp smell of blood. Every sound carried the threat of death. Elizabeth Vinson pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her cabin was small, made of rough pine logs and tucked deep into the forest. She could see the glow of distant fires through the trees, but the forest itself swallowed most of the light. Her 12-year-old son, Fritz, sat huddled by the stove. He shivered despite the thin warmth of the fire. Outside, the snow whispered against the windows as if warning them that danger could arrive at any moment. Elizabeth's hands were busy, kneading dough for a small loaf of bread. It was Christmas Eve and there was nothing to celebrate. The war had taken everything. Her husband was gone, drafted into the army long ago. Most civilians had fled the forest months back, but Elizabeth refused to leave. She believed the woods, with their thick trees and winding paths, were safer than the cities, which had already been reduced to rubble. She was wrong though. A sudden explosion rattled the cabin. The fire trembled in the stove, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Fritz clutched his knees. "Mother, was that?" he stammered. Elizabeth shook her head but didn't speak. Every sound was dangerous in the hurricane forest. The Americans were on one side, the Germans on the other, and the forest itself had no mercy. One wrong step, one careless noise, and bullets or frostbite could take them both. The hours crawled by. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional crack of the fire and Fritz's soft breathing. Then it happened. A knock. Not loud. Not demanding. Just 3 small, desperate raps on the heavy wooden door. Elizabeth froze. Her hands stopped moving. She had taught Fritz never to open the door to strangers. "Do not go," she whispered. But the knock came again. Softer this time but filled with fear. Fritz looked up, his wide eyes reflecting the small candlelight. "Mother, who is it?" he asked, voice trembling. Elizabeth shook her head. She didn't know. Could be German soldiers hunting for deserters. It could be bandits or worse. But then again, it could be someone needing help. In the forest, help was almost as rare as mercy. She crept to the door and pressed her ear against the cold wood. Voices, soft, foreign, trembling, reached her ears. They were speaking a language she did not understand. Not German. Not harsh commands. Not French either. Just soft, fearful words carried in the freezing night. Her heart pounded. She held the iron latch and slowly opened the door, just a crack. The wind rushed in, carrying snow and ice. And then she saw them. 3 figures, hunched, frozen to their boots. Their uniforms were olive green, soaked through with snow and frost. Their faces were pale, almost gray, and their eyes sunken with exhaustion. One was leaning heavily against a tree, barely able to stand. The others tried to speak, but the cold stole their words. Elizabeth recognized them immediately. They were Americans. The enemy. Her mind screamed warnings. Years of propaganda, of fear, of hatred, all rushed back. These were the people who had been killing her countrymen for years. The soldiers could be armed, ready to shoot her, ready to burn her cabin. Yet, she saw something else. She saw fear, hunger, cold, and exhaustion. She saw boys barely older than Fritz. Her chest tightened. The choice was clear. She could slam the door and leave them to die in the snow, or she could take the greatest risk of her life. One wrong move, one whisper, and she and Fritz would be executed for aiding the enemy. But these men, shivering and pale, could not survive the night outside. Elizabeth's heart ached. She thought of her son. She thought of her own humanity. Slowly, deliberately, she opened the door wider. "Come in," she whispered, her voice firm yet gentle. The Americans stumbled inside, dragging the cold with them. Their boots left icy trails across the floor. They collapsed near the stove, gasping, shivering. Fritz stared, frozen in awe and fear. He had never seen anything like this. The monsters the radio had warned him about were no monsters at all. They were just scared, human boys. Elizabeth's hands moved quickly. She took off their wet coats, wrapped them in blankets, and guided them to the small wooden chairs. She checked the wounded man first. His leg was torn, blood frozen in the snow. She tore strips from an old sheet, binding the wound as best she could. She placed a small loaf of bread on the table. It was not much, but it was all she had. For a few minutes, the cabin was silent, except for the sound of breathing and the crackling fire. Outside, the forest waited, full of death. Inside, a small, improbable warmth took root. Fritz watched as the American boys, still trembling, began to eat. For the first time in weeks, Elizabeth allowed herself to breathe. She had done the impossible. She had opened the door to the enemy, and they had not harmed her. But the forest was not done with them yet. Somewhere out there the war still raged. One knock, one noise, one mistake, and everything could end. Elizabeth knew the night was far from over. The danger was still alive, breathing in the dark trees outside. And so, in the small cabin in the frozen Hyrcan forest, on the night before Christmas, Elizabeth Vincent's courage had begun a story that would change the lives of 7 soldiers, and one mother and her son, forever. Cliffhanger: who would knock next at the door of this tiny cabin, and would Elizabeth's bravery be enough to save them all? The cabin was small, but that night it became the most dangerous place in the Hyrcan forest. Elizabeth Vincent's heart raced as she watched the 3 Americans struggle to regain warmth and strength. Their teeth chattered, and their pale faces reflected the flickering candlelight. One man, barely able to stand, leaned against the wall. His uniform was frozen stiff, and his hands were blue from the cold. Elizabeth's hands shook, but she forced herself to act. Fritz sat in the corner, wide-eyed, unsure whether to hide or help. He had never seen his mother move with such authority. "Mother, are they really Americans?" he whispered. Elizabeth nodded silently. Years of fear and propaganda told her to hate these men. But they were not killers here. They were boys, shivering, bleeding, and starving. Elizabeth moved quickly. She tore old sheets into strips to bandage the wounded man's leg. The bullet wound was deep, but the cold had slowed the bleeding. Carefully she wrapped the leg, tying the cloth tight enough to stop more blood from flowing, but not so tight that it would hurt him. "You must be careful," she muttered to Fritz. "Do as I say. Watch. Learn. Help." The other 2 Americans stared at her, exhausted and unsure. One tried to speak. We're lost," he said, his words broken and trembling. He pointed toward the forest. Elizabeth didn't understand every word, but she understood enough. They were trapped, hunted, freezing, and alone. If she didn't act, they would die before morning. Hours passed slowly. Elizabeth gave them small pieces of bread and hot water that barely passed for tea. The Americans ate quietly, still suspicious, still afraid. Fritz peeked at them, curiosity growing in his young mind. These were the boys he had been taught to fear, the ones who were supposed to kill Germans. But here, in this cabin, they were human. They were just cold, hungry, and terrified. Then came the sound that froze Elizabeth's heart. Another knock. Louder this time. 4 solid raps on the heavy wooden door. The Americans stiffened. Elizabeth's hands clenched the wooden table. Her mind raced. German soldiers. There was no other explanation. Fritz gasped. "Mother, they will kill us." Elizabeth shook her head, but fear gripped her like ice. The door had been opened once, and now it might bring death. She held up her hand to the Americans, signaling them to stay quiet and low. Slowly, carefully, she moved toward the door. Every step creaked on the wooden floor, sounding like a gunshot in the silence. When she opened the door, she saw 4 German soldiers in heavy gray coats. Their boots sank into the snow. Rifles hung across their chests. Their faces were stern, unreadable. The leader, a corporal, tipped his cap. "Merry Christmas," he said. His voice was calm, but Elizabeth knew the danger behind it. One wrong move, one word, and the cabin would explode in gunfire. Elizabeth forced herself to speak. "You are welcome to come in. You can warm yourself," she said, keeping her voice steady. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Inside the cabin, the Americans stayed frozen, rifles in hand, unsure whether to fire. Outside, the German soldiers waited, tension heavy in the cold air. The corporal stepped forward, his eyes scanning the cabin. He noticed the Americans, still armed and trembling. His face darkened. His hand drifted toward his MP40. Elizabeth stood her ground. She held her head high, the authority of a mother radiating from her. "Do not shoot," she commanded. "Tonight, it is Christmas. No one will die here." The corporal's men hesitated. The frozen wind howled around them as if urging violence. But Elizabeth did not move, did not flinch. She told them, softly but firmly, "There are boys inside. Boys like your sons. Cold, hungry, lost. Do not kill them. Do not kill me. Do not kill each other." For a long, tense moment, nothing moved. The room was silent except for the wind and the soft crackle of the stove. Then, slowly, the corporal lowered his rifle. One by one his men followed suit. Elizabeth guided them inside, still holding her gaze steady, still keeping control. The Americans relaxed slightly, though they did not lower their weapons entirely. Inside the cabin, the 7 armed men, the 3 Americans and the 4 Germans, stood facing each other, separated by Elizabeth and her small stove. Fritz watched, unable to speak. The danger had not gone. One wrong word, one sudden movement, could ignite violence in a heartbeat. But the miracle of courage and perhaps luck held them all in place. Elizabeth moved to the Americans. "It is time to eat," she said. She handed the youngest man a slice of bread and pointed to the stove. The warmth began to soften the tension just a little. She handed blankets to the German soldiers as well, helping them dry the snow from their uniforms. Slowly the fear began to melt. The smell of bread and roasting potatoes filled the cabin, pushing out the cold and the fear. Fritz watched, amazed. The soldiers, enemies for years, were now sharing space. Not as soldiers but as human beings. No guns were fired. No threats were made. Just the quiet warmth of a small cabin, the soft light of a candle, and a mother's courage holding back the war. But the night was far from over. The forest waited, full of danger. The war waited outside the door, and one mistake could end everything. Elizabeth knew this. She had bought time, a few precious hours, but the question remained, could humanity survive in the middle of the deadliest war in history? And so, in that small cabin, surrounded by snow, blood, and fear, a miracle began. A fragile truce that would defy armies, politics, and orders. One mother's courage had created a temporary peace, and the story of this Christmas Eve was only just beginning. Cliffhanger. Outside the cabin, the forest was dark and silent. Inside, 7 men, enemies for years, sat together. But one sound, one knock, or one misstep could destroy the fragile peace. Would they survive the night? The cabin was quiet now, but the air was heavy with tension. 7 armed men sat under one roof, 3 Americans for Germans, and a small boy watched, wide-eyed, from the corner. Outside, the Hurricane forest was a frozen battlefield. Bullets had not yet reached the cabin, but the threat of death pressed against the walls like a storm waiting to break. Elizabeth Vinson moved with calm precision. She handed blankets to the German soldiers first, helping them brush the snow from their heavy coats. Then she tended to the Americans again, making sure the wounded man's leg was secure. Fritz watched every movement, amazed by his mother's courage. She wasn't just a mother, she was a commander in her own right, standing between life and death. For the first time that night she spoke to both sides together. Her voice was quiet, but it carried authority. "Tonight there will be no fighting. You are here to survive, not to kill. Sit. Warm yourselves." The men stared at her. Guns were still in their hands, but slowly, hesitantly, they lowered them. The danger had not disappeared, but for now, fear was replaced with something else, awe. Elizabeth moved to the small table in the center of the cabin. She placed the last loaf of bread on it. It was not much, but it would have to be enough. She broke the bread into pieces, handing them to the Americans first. Then she offered them to the Germans. Fritz helped, distributing small cups of bitter water that barely passed for tea. The wounded American, his leg bandaged with strips of cloth, tried to speak. His voice trembled. "Thank you, madam," he said. Elizabeth nodded, but she did not smile. There was no time for joy. The forest outside still threatened, the war waited, and one wrong word could destroy everything. Slowly the men began to eat. The smell of bread and the small warmth from the stove filled the cabin. The Americans slumped into chairs, exhausted, and for the first time in weeks their eyes softened. The German soldiers, too, relaxed, rubbing their frozen hands together, warming themselves by the fire. Fritz could not believe what he saw. Enemies, once trained to kill, were now sitting side by side, sharing food in silence. Elizabeth's eyes moved from one group to the other. She understood something that soldiers did not always realize. Hatred could be paused. Fear could be replaced by compassion. War could be held at bay, if only for a few hours, by courage and humanity. She spoke softly. "Think of your families. Think of your mothers. Remember that we are all human. We are all cold, hungry, scared. Tonight, the war does not exist." Her words hung in the air like a spell. Slowly, conversations began. The Americans showed pictures of home, small photographs of wives, girlfriends, and children. The German soldiers shared memories of Dusseldorf, of Christmases before the war, of families waiting by the fire. Fritz listened, amazed. The men were laughing softly, sharing jokes that the others didn't fully understand. The cabin, once a place of terror, had become a sanctuary. Time moved strangely inside the cabin. Minutes stretched, blending into hours. Outside, the forest remained silent, filled with danger. Inside, the impossible had happened. Soldiers who were enemies trained to kill each other were now eating, talking, and laughing together. The wounds, both visible and invisible, began to soften. Elizabeth watched the wounded American carefully. She knew the night was temporary. The warmth would fade. The war would come back with sunrise. But for now she allowed herself a small hope. She had done what generals and armies could not. She had created a truce in the middle of the deadliest battle of the war. Fritz, sitting on a small stool, reached for a piece of bread offered by one of the Americans. The boy who had been terrified just hours ago now smiled. The soldiers noticed and smiled back. A small, fragile moment of peace had emerged from the cold, bloodied forest. Then came a sound that sent a shiver through Elizabeth's spine, the distant crack of gunfire. Somewhere not far away the Battle of the Bulge continued. Artillery roared, men screamed, and the forest trembled. But inside the cabin the miracle held. The men did not move their rifles. They trusted the courage of the woman in the apron. For one night the war had stopped. Elizabeth looked at the 7 men before her, 3 Americans, 4 Germans. They were all young, frightened, and weary. She saw hope flicker in their eyes. They would leave the cabin alive, perhaps not forever, but tonight they were brothers in survival. Hours passed. The men ate quietly, drank small sips of water, and warmed themselves by the stove. Fritz watched them, absorbing every detail, knowing he would remember this night for the rest of his life. The truce was fragile. One mistake, one loud noise, and everything could end. But for now they survived. As midnight approached, the cabin was quiet again. The men leaned back, exhausted but alive. Elizabeth prepared a small area for them to rest. Fritz curled up on the floor beside the stove, tired but filled with awe. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the forest in white. The world was still at war, but inside the cabin humanity had triumphed, if only for a few precious hours. And so, in the frozen Hurricane Forest on Christmas Eve 1944, Elizabeth Vinson did the impossible. She paused the war. She brought enemies together with bread, fire, and courage. The night was hers, and for the soldiers, it was a gift they would never forget. Cliffhanger, but the dawn would come, and with it, the cold reality of war. Would the fragile truce survive the morning? Could the courage of one woman change the course of lives forever, or would the forest claim them all once again? The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters. It was not a bright morning but a dull, gray light that seemed to weigh on the cabin. Elizabeth Vinson stirred quietly. The night had been a fragile miracle, a pause in a war that had claimed millions of lives. But now morning had come. And with it, the world outside was waiting, ruthless and unforgiving. Fritz opened his eyes and saw the soldiers beginning to stir. The Americans stretched stiffly, their frozen muscles aching from the cold night. The Germans rubbed their hands, still warming themselves near the stove. For a moment, everything seemed calm. The 7 men had survived the night together. The impossible truce had held. Elizabeth moved quickly. She prepared a small breakfast, thin porridge and more bread. Fritz helped quietly, carrying bowls and water. The men ate in silence. The magic of the night had not vanished, but it was fragile, like ice on a river that could crack at any moment. Every sound from the forest outside made Elizabeth's heart race. The bullets, the tanks, the chaos, they were all still out there. The wounded American, his legs stiff and sore, leaned on the table. He was grateful, but he knew the night could not last forever. We must leave soon," he whispered. Elizabeth nodded. She knew the danger that awaited them once they stepped outside. The forest had not stopped being a battlefield, and the snow would not protect them from bullets or tanks. The German corporal, the leader of the 4 soldiers, stood and adjusted his coat. He glanced at Elizabeth and Fritz. His eyes were tired, but there was a faint respect in them. He had witnessed something he would never forget. A woman, alone and unarmed, holding life and death in her hands. The corporal knew that outside the rules of war were cruel. Inside the cabin they had been human. Elizabeth handed the wounded American his small bag of supplies and pointed toward the back door. "Follow the stream," she said. "It will lead you to your lines. It is safer than the main road. Be careful." The corporal noticed her gesture and nodded. He had seen enough to know she was giving them a lifeline, a chance to survive the deadly morning. Fritz watched as the soldiers gathered their weapons. The rifles and MP-40s were cold in their hands, heavy with the weight of war. The Americans and Germans exchanged cautious glances. The truce inside the cabin had been fragile, and now reality was creeping back in. Soon they would be enemies again, standing on opposite sides of a battlefield that would not forgive hesitation. Elizabeth stepped outside first. The cold bit her face, but she held herself steady. She walked to the pile of weapons stacked near the woodpile. Carefully she returned the guns to their owners. The Americans and Germans gripped them once more, the familiar weight grounding them in the rules of war. The magic of the night was ending. The war was waiting just beyond the cabin door. The wounded American, supported by his two companions, began the slow journey toward the stream. Each step was careful, calculated, every snow-covered tree a potential danger. The German soldiers turned south, disappearing into the fog of the forest. They were walking back into the chaos they had survived just hours before. Fritz's heart ached. He knew that most of them might never see another Christmas. Elizabeth stood on the porch, watching the soldiers disappear into the trees. The forest, once silent during the truce, was now alive again with distant gunfire and the roar of artillery. She knew that life would return to the cabin, but the forest outside was unforgiving. The war had not stopped. It had only paused. Fritz reached for his mother's hand. "Mother, will they live?" he asked, his voice trembling. Elizabeth hugged him tightly. "I do not know," she said. "But we gave them one night. One night of humanity. That is something no war can take away." The gray morning pressed down on them. The snow sparkled coldly in the weak light, hiding the horrors beneath. Yet, in that moment, Elizabeth felt a quiet pride. She had faced death not with a gun but with courage. She had held back the tide of hatred with warmth and bread. And for a few hours, enemies had been brothers. Fritz looked back toward the forest, seeing the footprints in the snow, the paths of survival that diverged north and south. He realized that this night would stay with him forever. It would teach him that even in the darkest times, one person could make a difference. One act of bravery, one choice to be humane, could ripple through lives and history. And yet, the morning reminded them of a cruel truth: war does not forgive. The soldiers walked back into the carnage. The forest was silent no more. Guns fired, tanks rolled, and men fell. The miracle of the night was over. The impossible truce had ended. But inside the cabin, Elizabeth and Fritz remained. They had survived. And in that small victory there was hope. For the soldiers who had left, the night might be their last memory of peace. But for Elizabeth and Fritz, it was a lesson that courage and humanity could endure, even in the deadliest places on earth. Cliffhanger: the truce had ended, but the story was far from over. Would the soldiers survive the forest? Would Fritz ever see them again? Could one mother's courage echo through time and change the lives of those who had walked into her cabin that Christmas Eve? The forest was quiet, but it was a dangerous quiet. The snow crunched beneath the soldiers' boots as they carefully followed the small stream Elizabeth had pointed out. The wounded American, Herbie, leaned heavily on his companions, Jim and Ralph. Every step was slow and painful, but they knew that stopping was not an option. The forest held death in every shadow. The night's fragile truce was over. The Americans had returned to the reality of the Battle of the Bulge. Snow-covered trees hid the German patrols, and the distant rumble of artillery reminded them that the world outside the cabin was still at war. Ralph glanced at the map the German corporal had given them. It was the only guide through the maze of frozen ravines and dense pines. Without it, they would have walked straight into the enemy. Jim shivered violently. The cold had seeped into his bones during the night, and now every breath felt like ice. "I don't think I can make it," he whispered, his voice shaking. Herbie groaned, pain twisting his face. Ralph held them both, supporting their weight. "We can make it," he said. "We have to. Follow the stream. Trust the compass." The stream, frozen in some places and flowing weakly in others, became their lifeline. They moved carefully, avoiding sharp rocks and hidden holes beneath the snow. The forest was silent, but the silence was deadly. Every snapping twig, every distant crack of ice, could mean enemy soldiers were nearby. The men moved like shadows, keeping low, alert, and tense. Meanwhile, the German soldiers walked south, following a different path. They had returned to their lines, but danger awaited them too. The winter had made movement treacherous, and the American counterattack was coming. The corporal, responsible for the men under his command, felt the weight of every step. He had disobeyed orders to save these Americans, but now he had to survive himself. Back with the Americans, the wounded Herbie fell once, snow giving way beneath his weak legs. Jim and Ralph caught him, their muscles straining. The pain in Herbie's leg was intense, but he gritted his teeth, knowing they could not stop. Every second they lingered, the risk grew. Somewhere in the forest, bullets could find them, tanks could crush them, and the cold could take them if they slowed down. Hours passed. The sun struggled to rise, hiding behind heavy gray clouds. Visibility was poor, and the snow reflected the weak light, making it hard to see the depth of the ravines and the obstacles ahead. The soldiers moved slowly, carefully, one step at a time. Fatigue set in. Muscles screamed. Fingers were numb. Faces were pale from cold and exhaustion. Yet they did not give up. They had survived the cabin. They could survive the forest. Ralph held the compass tightly. The German corporal's words echoed in his mind, "Trust the needle. Trust the stream." He checked the map again, plotting the safest route. The path was longer than the main road, but it was empty. If they had taken the obvious path, death would have been waiting. The soldiers' trust in Elizabeth's guidance was the only thing keeping them alive. At one point they came to a frozen ravine. The water below was hidden beneath snow and ice, and one wrong step could send them plummeting to their deaths. Ralph went first, testing each step. Herbie followed, leaning on Jim and Ralph. Every step was a risk. The men's hearts pounded in their chests, not just from exertion but from fear. Death seemed close enough to touch. Suddenly the sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. The men froze, pressed against the snow-covered bank. Bullets whistled overhead, striking trees and snow around them. The forest was alive with danger again. "Move," Ralph whispered. They ran, jumping over fallen branches and avoiding hidden pits, adrenaline keeping them alive. Each step carried them further from the cabin but closer to enemy lines, and closer to uncertainty. The wounded Herbie faltered again. Ralph and Jim held him tight. "Almost there," Ralph muttered, though he was not sure if it was true. The forest seemed endless, a white maze of trees, ice and snow. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the howl of the wind, could be death. And yet the soldiers pressed forward. Survival was all that mattered now. Finally, after what felt like hours, the faint signs of the American lines appeared. Small markers, broken trees and distant voices confirmed their path. Relief surged through the men, but it was cautious. They knew that one wrong move could end everything. They were not safe until they were behind the protection of their comrades and fortifications. Behind them, the German soldiers also returned to their lines. The corporal and his men had survived the deadly journey south, but they knew their act of mercy could cost them their lives if discovered. The forest had claimed much already, and the war was relentless. Yet, in that small window of time, 7 lives had been touched by courage, compassion, and humanity. Fritz and Elizabeth waited by the cabin, anxious and silent. They had given the soldiers a chance to survive, but the forest would decide if that chance was enough. Fritz's heart pounded as he watched the snow, hoping the footprints he had seen at dawn would not end in tragedy. Elizabeth held her son tightly, whispering prayers for their safety. Cliffhanger. The soldiers were alive, but for how long? Would the forest, the bullets, and the war allow them to reach safety? And what price would the German soldiers pay for their mercy? The true test of courage was not inside the cabin, but in the deadly journey back through the frozen forest. The forest finally ended, giving way to the first signs of human life. The stream widened, leading them to the edge of the American lines. Ralph, Jim, and the wounded Herbie stumbled forward, exhausted but alive. Their boots were soaked, faces pale, fingers numb. Every step forward felt like a small victory, a fragile escape from death itself. The soldiers hesitated at the edge of the camp. They had survived the frozen forest, but fear still gripped them. Would someone notice the condition they were in? Would they be questioned, accused, or worse, suspected of desertion? The horrors of war had made trust rare. And yet hope pushed them forward. Ralph lifted Herbie's arm, steadying him as they approached the first sentries. Voices called out. Questions were asked. The Americans were confused, astonished. "Where have you been? How did you survive?" Herbie could barely speak, the pain in his leg nearly unbearable. Ralph pointed to the compass the German corporal had given him, a small, battered instrument that had guided them through the maze of snow and death. The soldiers were taken to a small field hospital. Medics worked quickly, tending to Herbie's wound, treating frostbite, and offering warm drinks. For the first time in days, the 3 men felt safe. But the memories of the cabin, of Elizabeth and Fritz, haunted them. They had been strangers, enemies even, yet they had found shelter, warmth, and care. The war had not stopped, but humanity had survived that night. Meanwhile, Fritz Winken waited anxiously in the cabin, pacing the small wooden floor. Elizabeth had sent prayers into the cold morning air, hoping the soldiers would find their way. The hours stretched, the silence heavier than the sounds of war outside. Fritz's mind raced. Had the Americans survived? Had the Germans survived their journey south? The forest was deadly, and even the strongest could fall. Days passed. Letters arrived slowly, carried by military couriers. News trickled back to Fritz and Elizabeth. The Americans had survived, reaching safety thanks to the compass and the guidance of the German corporal. Relief washed over them, but so did sorrow. The German soldiers, brave men who had helped their enemies, had likely not survived the counterattacks. The reality of war was harsh, and courage did not always protect life. Years went by. Fritz grew older, the memories of that Christmas Eve never fading. He remembered the warmth of the stove, the smell of roasting chicken, and the bravery of his mother. Elizabeth never spoke of the night outside the cabin. It was a secret, a story too fragile, too incredible to share. But Fritz knew the truth. He had seen it with his own eyes, felt it in the fear, the tension, and the quiet moments of humanity in the midst of destruction. In the 1980s, Fritz decided to find them. He wanted to know what had happened to Ralph, Jim, and Herbie. He did not have last names for all of them, only memories of faces and first names. Letters were sent, phone calls made, records searched. Many doors closed. The story seemed too perfect, too impossible, a fairy tale amidst the blood and mud of the Battle of the Bulge. Then, in 1995, a breakthrough came. A television producer contacted Fritz, interested in his story for a show called Unsolved Mysteries. Fritz agreed to share what he knew. The cameras captured his nervous hands, his trembling voice, the memories of that night. Reenactments were filmed. The cabin, the snow, the 7 soldiers, and the courage of a single mother who had stopped war for a few precious hours. Weeks later, a letter arrived from a nursing home in Maryland. The handwriting was shaky, the script aged by time. Ralph Blank had seen the broadcast. His memory, clouded by dementia, cleared for a moment as he recognized the cabin, the German woman, and the warmth she had shown him. Fritz immediately booked a flight to meet him. His heart pounded with hope and fear. What if it was a mistake? What if Ralph did not remember? When Fritz arrived, he saw a frail old man in a wheelchair. Ralph looked at him with eyes that seemed distant, then suddenly focused, clear as the winter night of 1944. "Your mother?" Ralph whispered, his voice trembling. "She made me soup." Fritz's eyes filled with tears. The impossible was real. The memories, the truce, the cabin, all had existed. Ralph handed Fritz the compass, worn from 50 years of careful keeping. It had guided him through the deadly forest and kept him alive. Fritz learned more. Woody Vost, the quiet American who had helped carry Herbie, was also alive. Over the phone, the old man wept, telling Fritz that the memory of that night had never left him. For 50 years he had recounted the story to anyone who would listen, but few had believed him. And now, at last, the boy who had witnessed it all could confirm the truth. Cliffhanger: the 7 soldiers' lives had been touched forever by Elizabeth's courage. But the story was not over. Could Fritz find the remaining German soldiers? Could he learn their fate? And how would the world react to the secret of that miraculous Christmas Eve? Years had passed since that cold Christmas Eve in 1944. The Hurricane forest had healed. Snow had fallen and melted countless times. Trees had grown taller, paths had shifted, and the scars of artillery had slowly disappeared under moss and earth. But for Fritz Vincan, the memories of that night never faded. Every detail, the cabin, the warmth of the stove, the smell of roasting chicken, the fear and courage, remained vivid in his mind. Fritz had grown into a man shaped by that night. He had moved far from Europe, settling in Hawaii, opening a small bakery. Kneading dough and baking bread reminded him of his mother, Elizabeth, and the lessons she had taught. Courage, kindness, and humanity could shine even in the darkest hours. But the story of the Christmas truce haunted him. Who were the soldiers he had helped? Had they survived the war? And most importantly, what had become of the German corporal who had risked everything to guide the Americans to safety? Then in 1995, fate intervened. A television producer, fascinated by Fritz's story, invited him to share it on Unsolved Mysteries. Fritz agreed. Cameras filmed him in his bakery, his hands shaking as he recounted the night. Reenactments showed the cabin, the snow, and the 7 soldiers who had survived only because of the courage of a single mother. The broadcast reached millions, and for Fritz, hope and fear collided. Could any of the soldiers from that night still be alive? Would they remember him, or had the years erased them like footprints in the snow? A few weeks later, a letter arrived from a nursing home in Maryland. The handwriting was shaky, aged by time, yet the message was clear. Ralph Blank had seen the broadcast. His memory, clouded by dementia, had cleared for a moment. He remembered the cabin, Elizabeth's courage, and the warmth that had saved him. Fritz booked a flight immediately, heart pounding, unsure what he would find. The reunion was quiet but profound. Ralph, now a frail old man, looked at Fritz and whispered, "Your mother, she made me soup." Tears filled Fritz's eyes. 50 years of memories, doubts, and questions were answered in that single moment. The compass the German corporal had given Ralph still rested in his hand, worn smooth from decades of careful keeping. It had guided him through the deadly forest and kept him alive. Ralph's gratitude could not be measured in words. Fritz's search did not end there. Woody Vost, the quiet American who had helped carry Herbie, was also alive. Over the phone, Woody wept as he spoke to Fritz. "You are real," he said. "I never thought I would see the boy from the cabin again." Together they recalled the night, the fear, the laughter, the shared meal, the fragile truce in the middle of war. They remembered Elizabeth Vinson, the mother who had stood between enemies, demanding peace with nothing but courage and compassion. Yet the story had its shadows. The German corporal and his men who had walked south into the enemy's counterattack were likely dead. Fritz searched through military records and archives but found no trace. The harsh reality of war returned. Courage did not always protect life. Still, Elizabeth's act had given one last night of humanity to 7 soldiers. She had reminded them that even in war, people could care for one another, see each other as humans rather than enemies. Fritz never forgot the lessons of that night. He shared the story with Ralph and Woody, with their families, and eventually with the world. He spoke of courage, sacrifice, and the power of simple human kindness. The story of Elizabeth Vinson became a beacon, a reminder that even one person, a single mother with love for her child, could stand against the cruelty of the world and make a difference. On the day Fritz passed away in 2002, just weeks before Christmas, he knew the story had lived on. He had seen the soldiers, heard their gratitude, and carried the memory of his mother's bravery with him. He died knowing the world remembered at least a little, that one night in a cabin in the frozen Hurricane Forest. Today hikers walk through the Hurricane Forest, unaware of the miracle that occurred there. The cabin is gone. The snow hides the footprints of that night. But the story remains. It lives in the hearts of those who hear it, a reminder that even in the darkest times, courage, kindness, and humanity can strike a match in the coldest winter. Elizabeth Vinson may have been forgotten by the world, but in the lives of 7 soldiers, in the memory of her son, and in the stories shared across decades, she remains alive. She showed that peace is not only something signed in palaces or discussed by generals, it is a choice, a moment, a single act of bravery that can echo through history. And as the story ends, one question remains. If the knock came at your door, would you have the courage to open it? Could you break bread with your enemy? Could you choose humanity when the world demands fear? That is the legacy of the Christmas truce of 1944, the night the war stopped even for a few hours because one mother had the courage to act.